This is Bloomberg Law with June Grasso from Bloomberg Radio.
Hi, everyone. It's Show here. As you may have heard, Congress passed a bill that the president signed into law that is designed to ban TikTok in the United States. That will take TikTok away from you and 170 million Americans who find community and connection on our platform.
TikTok CEO Shou Chew wasted no time in telling the app's users that the company was going to fight in the courts to challenge a new law requiring it to sell the popular video sharing app or face a ban.
Rest assured, we aren't going anywhere. We are confident and we will keep fighting for your rights in the courts. The facts and the Constitution are on our side, and we expect to prevail again.
Again, because TikTok has been successful in blocking attempts to ban it. But this legal battle pitting free speech rights against national security interests will be prolonged and will likely end up at the Supreme Court. Joining me is Professor Eric Goldman, co-director of the High-Tech Law Institute at Santa Clara University School of Law. So TikTok, in suing, said, for the first time in history, Congress has enacted a law that subjects a single-name speech platform to a permanent national ban and bars every American from participating. That's true, isn't it? This is unprecedented.
To my knowledge, it is. And it's really important for your listeners to understand that the legislation specifically names TikTok as a company and says this company cannot exist in its current format. And that's a pretty rare thing for a legislature to do.
Tell us about the complaint. You know, the main causes of action, the main reasons why TikTok says this is unconstitutional.
TikTok claims that the divestiture requirement, at peril of being banned, violates the Constitution, violates its First Amendment rights, is a unconstitutional bill of attainder, and it violates its equal protection rights. But the real payload is about the First Amendment. That's where everyone expects the action to be, that Congress is shutting down TikTok's speech.
As far as Congress shutting down TikTok speech, which seems pretty obvious, what are the defenses that the government can use to defend against that?
The primary rebuttal will be that Congress acted based on national security concerns, that there are serious concerns about the ways in which TikTok operates that jeopardize national interests here in the United States. The problem with that argument is that we as the public haven't seen that data. To the extent that the data has been made available to Congress, it was done so in large part under seal, which means that Congress has seen information that the public hasn't. It's possible that we would agree that the evidence is significant and troubling. It's also possible that it's completely fictional. And so we don't know how to evaluate this national security justification for the ban, in part because we don't have the evidence that Congress has been relying upon.
That's something that the complaint alleges. The government has yet to provide evidence of the Chinese government misusing TikTok. And they also say that the concern is just about a hypothetical possibility that TikTok could be misused in the future. I mean, has there been any evidence at all in the public that TikTok has been misused or that the Chinese government is using it?
There have been some whistleblower-type complaints that have provided some evidence suggesting that. Those complaints have been subject to their own critical scrutiny, so it's a little hard to know how reliable they are. But I think that it's important to reinforce the hypothetical nature of this, that the evidence showing that the Chinese government is actually undermining our national security using TikTok is vanishingly thin, if not non-existent. And so it's uncomfortable and perhaps impermissible under the First Amendment for Congress to ban an app on the potential that it might cause some future harm. If that's the grounds for banning speech, then of course legislators can always manufacture those types of hypothetical concerns.
So if this goes to trial, would a court, or even before trial, would a court ask the government to provide evidence that their concerns are real and not just speculation?
Yeah, there will be no doubt that in order for the government to prevail, they're going to have to show some of the evidence that was shown to Congress, and they'll likely do that under seal. And I believe, in fact, that's why this case is being litigated and the particular venue is being litigated in, because I think that court regularly deals with national security concerns, so they may have the clearances necessary in order for the government to even share the evidence.
The D.C. Circuit.
Correct. That's an unusual thing, as you know. Normally, litigation starts at a district court with a single judge, but instead, this is going to an appellate court, which is likely to have multiple judges on the panel, and that's a weird place for a case like this to start, because the appellate court's not in the business normally of doing evidence gathering and review, and they're going to have to do that in this case.
Content-based restrictions have to meet a higher level of scrutiny. So will the government have to explain why it didn't pursue less speech-restrictive alternatives to address its concerns?
One of the ways that the government can justify the interventions it made, this divest or ban, is by saying that there were no better other options that would have preserved speech and still accomplished the government's goals. So we used the phraseology, were there less restrictive alternatives to the government? If so, then the method that they chose impacted speech too greatly. There was a way of doing it without impacting speech quite as much, and the Constitution would require that lesser alternative.
The complaint argues that a sale from ByteDance isn't possible and that the law would force a shutdown. Is that because of the Chinese government's restrictions on the sale of certain technologies like algorithms?
The complaint makes a number of arguments about why it would be impossible to divest. There are some concerns about transferring the algorithm, and there may be limits from the Chinese government on the transference of the algorithm. And also, the complaint describes how the overall platform has this massive code base that can't easily be carved off or segregated to a new buyer that the buyer could then just step in and start running, that it needs a lot of attention from developers who understand the code in order to keep it running and to keep improving on it. And so there are arguments that it would take a long time for a buyer to get up to speed sufficient enough to be able to take on the code base. And so the code base is a practical limitation on the sale, in addition to whatever technical or legal restrictions there are.
Stephen Mnuchin, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, told Bloomberg that he's still interested in buying TikTok's U.S. operations.
I've actually spoken to a lot of tech companies on working about rebuilding this. I do believe the algorithms could be rebuilt.
I mean, is that doable to replicate their algorithm?
I guess. In theory, it's possible that U.S. ingenuity could, catch up to and maybe even surpass the existing technology. The reality is that the U.S. competitors to TikTok have not been able to crack that nut, despite the fact that they are extremely well-financed and highly motivated. Turns out that TikTok's secret sauce has worked really, really well and isn't easily replicated. So any buyer who thinks that they can step in and with a snap of a finger keep doing what TikTok is doing is not reading the lessons from the existing competitors.
And is that secret sauce its sort of uncanny ability to learn about your interests based on how long you stay on a video and then deliver items of interest to you? Is that the secret sauce?
I think that's the main secret sauce. I'm sure there are others, but it's the For You options on TikTok where they're able to deliver videos that are customized for each user that the users really respond to and that it actually speaks to them. And it turns out that's a really hard thing to do. Lots and lots of people have tried that over the years, and TikTok has found a magic to being able to do that for its users.
TikTok said any divestiture would disconnect Americans from the rest of the global community on a platform devoted to shared content. So TikTok would go on in the rest of the world, but America would be shut off from it.
I didn't really understand exactly what that meant. There certainly could be ways of sharing videos across services. There could be some kind of technological connection with proper licensing that allow the videos to show up. They still might not be the same if the algorithms delivering them are different. So even if the content's the same, if the algorithms lead to different results, it's still not quite a seamless, integrated global solution. So I'm not exactly sure how that would work, and I wasn't quite following exactly what TikTok was saying there.
Could Americans, if they wanted to flout the law, Could they, even if TikTok is banned here, could they just go on TikTok anyway?
In theory, if they could find a way to get the app installed, then the ban would not prevent them from doing so. However, there are other laws that have been enacted here in the United States that have banned users from installing TikTok, especially those who are in, for example, government positions. And to date, those laws have been upheld, so it's possible that there would be other reasons why users would not be legally permitted to do so. Having said that, as a practical matter, if everyone is trying to get on TikTok by getting around some relatively effective ban, over time TikTok's just not going to have the same kind of investment and enthusiasm that it has today. So it might be technically possible to do it, but it wouldn't be the same TikTok. It would lose a lot of its creative force.
Coming up next on the Bloomberg Law Show, I'll continue this conversation with Professor Eric Goldman of Santa Clara University Law School. We'll talk about the chances that TikTok's lawsuit will succeed. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg. China-based ByteDance has made clear it won't comply with a new U.S. law requiring it to sell its popular TikTok video sharing app. The company has filed a legal challenge to the law. I've been talking to Professor Eric Goldman of the Santa Clara University School of Law. TikTok also argues that a ban would devastate 7 million businesses and shutter a platform that contributes $24 billion annually to the U.S. economy. Do you think those figures are accurate?
They're obviously self-interested calculations, so I don't know if they're right. But they don't have to be right to still be helpful. The bottom line is that there's a lot of economic activity taking place here in the United States that's being driven by TikTok, and in theory, Congress has said we want all of that to shut down. Now, some of them might migrate to other services, so it's not like it would be completely lost. But in a time when we're concerned about employment and we're concerned about the economy, the idea that we would take a major step back is a huge opportunity cost. And it really makes me wonder if the people who voted for the ban really understood who they might be benefiting and who they might be hurting. Chances are the people who voted for the ban are going to be hurting their own constituents.
I believe the last time we spoke, you said you thought the reason for the ban was because lawmakers have a target on China.
It's impossible to talk about the TikTok ban without talking about the fact that China is one of the regulatory bogeymen. It's a constant target for politicians to keep going back and saying, we're being tough on China, so you should continue to support our efforts. So from that perspective, if TikTok was in the hands of some other government or in the hands of a company based in some other country, almost certainly we wouldn't see the kind of regulatory blowback we're seeing here. This is part of a long-term, broad-based anti-China effort in the United States.
So the lawsuit indicates that ByteDance doesn't have any intention of trying to find a buyer for TikTok. The deadline is January. Do you think that the D.C. court will speed up the case, or does January seem like too soon to settle this?
I think one of the reasons why the Congress specified that the challenges law would go through this D.C. Circuit review was to accelerate the answers, to try and speed up getting a resolution to whether or not the ban was permissible. So there's no guarantee that the D.C. Circuit will respond that fast, but I'm sure they get the point. They know the deadline, and I would expect them to do everything they could to try and get an answer before then.
But this might end up at the Supreme Court.
Seems inevitable that it will end up at the Supreme Court. But if we get the initial court ruling in favor of TikTok, there will be a staying of the law until there's appellate review. And even if the government wins, there might still be a staying of the law where the D.C. Circuit requests to preserve the status quo until the Supreme Court can weigh in. But there's no question that this ban, whichever way it's ruled on, is going to go to the Supreme Court. Now, they have the discretion whether or not to take it. They might not take the case, but it seems likely that this ban is going to end up at the Supreme Court and get a ruling on it.
Bloomberg Intelligence, an analyst, gives TikTok a 30% chance to win. Do you give TikTok a more than 30% chance to win?
I would assign TikTok's probability of success in this case is much greater than 30%. And I do that in part because this is not a new question. This question has been litigated several times in the last few years, and the courts have universally held in favor of TikTok. So it's possible that this ban is better than all the other ones have been challenged, but more likely the same problems that doomed those other bans are going to also doom this one as well. So, yeah, if I were a betting man, I would be putting my money on TikTok, not on the government.
And remind us what happened when former President Trump used an executive order to try to force the sale of TikTok to an American company or face a ban.
So there were several attempts to ban TikTok and in some cases a similar app, WeChat, that came out of the Trump era. And those failed on a variety of grounds. Some of them failed on the president's authority to ban an app, and some of them failed on First Amendment grounds. So it was like a panoply of problems. It wasn't like there was just one problem with the prior effort. And then there have also been state efforts to ban TikTok. And so there was a state effort in Montana that was also subject to constitutional review, where the court said there was a panoply of problems with that law as well, including the First Amendment. So the fact that executive orders by the president and state bans by state legislators is different from a congressional law, there's a reason why it could be distinguished, but the core concerns about the First Amendment have shown up in all of the challenges, and that's the thing that Congress can't get around.
And are there other governments that are taking action or have taken action against TikTok?
Yes, and in particular, the most noteworthy one is India, where TikTok was also banned. And that might give some comfort to people who say that we're not the first to do it. And it might also give some concern to people because India has routinely shut down conversations that the government feels are a threat to its power. And so we shouldn't be taking playbooks out of India's efforts to regulate speech. They approach it very differently than we do.
And, when the Trump administration pressed for TikTok's sale, China's foreign ministry said the precedent of acquiring a company under the pretense of protecting national security could lead to foreign countries targeting U.S. companies, calling it the opening of a Pandora's box. Do you think that's just a threat or is possible?
No, that's a bona fide concern. I would view Congress's ban on TikTok as the latest salvo in the ongoing digital trade war that basically country A blocks country B's companies from having access to markets, so country B retaliates against country A's technology, and then they just keep going. And China has already played that game multiple ways. For example, China has banned multiple services from having access to Chinese market, including, I can't even keep them all straight, certainly Google and LinkedIn. And then most recently, just while Congress was contemplating this ban, China banned WhatsApp, a U.S.-based asset, from having access to Chinese market. So we retaliate against China by passing a TikTok ban. China retaliates against us with some further bans, and we get locked in the digital trade war. And the number one thing that everyone should know by this point is that no one wins trade wars. Everyone loses in those equations. So the fact that we're playing the trade war game is actually to our detriment.
Eric, we haven't talked about TikTok's complaint that it's being treated differently from certain other platforms. It's a little complicated, so take us through it.
The statute expressly says that review websites are not governed by the divest or be banned law. So it sets up a weird game that potentially regulable companies could play where they could have an app that is worse than TikTok in whatever way people want to imagine, but they would still be categorically immune from this law if that same company offered a review website that took the company out of the scope of the law. Now, TikTok doesn't even have the chance to play that game because TikTok is expressly named in the bill. They're not given the option of being excluded whatsoever. And so they say that it's unfair that you could have a review website and avoid the law, but TikTok isn't given that choice. But it also raises the illogic. Why would we say that social media services under a government operation are a danger to our country, but review websites aren't? And it's really hard to justify that distinction. And the reason, of course, is because review websites are excluded based on specific lobbying by companies who would benefit from that. And so it's not really a defensible distinction, but it creates a constitutional problem by making that distinction.
And what about the TikTok users? Are we going to see a lawsuit from them as well?
It's unlikely that there will be a separate lawsuit filed by TikTok users who will independently advance their free speech claims because their ability to talk to each other is being affected by this ban. And so they ought to have standing to complain about the censorship of their content and to make the case that, in fact, any of the other justifications like national security are not sufficient to override their free speech interests.
Another interesting aspect of this is that TikTok also complained that Congress ignored its work to protect U.S. data from foreign government influence.
TikTok has undertaken extensive efforts to try to please the U.S. government, and they were negotiating a very lengthy document that would allow the government to have oversight into the ability of the Chinese government to influence TikTok's operation and to base all the content here in the United States. TikTok has said that it's going to implement a number of those pieces irrespective of the law and whatever the court holdings are. But the bottom line is TikTok is saying that they're comfortable with having the government monitor their behavior and oversee their behavior. They just don't want to be regulated in this other way. And it's weird for me, as someone who's interested in the free speech rights of TikTok and its users, for TikTok to say it's not like we are opposed to regulation, just do it in a way that we can live with, as opposed to saying there really should be no reason why the government gets this oversight at all. The First Amendment prohibits it. So it's really an interesting positioning by TikTok to be pro-regulation, but only if it meets its standards, not free speech, and oppose all regulation.
Well, I'm sure we'll have many, many opportunities to talk about this lawsuit as it winds its way, probably up to the Supreme Court. Thanks so much, Eric. That's Professor Eric Goldman, co-director of the High-Tech Law Institute at Santa Clara University School of Law. Coming up next on the Bloomberg Law Show, we'll get a first-hand account of what happened when Stormy Daniels took the stand to testify against Donald Trump. I'm June Grasso, and this is Bloomberg. The testimony was by far the most awaited spectacle in a trial that has moved between tabloid-esque elements and dry record-keeping details. A courtroom appearance by a porn star who says she had an intimate encounter with a former American president. With Donald Trump sitting just feet away, Stormy Daniels testified Tuesday at his hush money trial about a sexual encounter she says they had in 2006 that resulted in her being paid to keep silent during the presidential race 10 years later. Joining me is Bloomberg legal reporter Patricia Hurtado, who was in the courtroom for the testimony. Pat, tell us a little about her appearance.
What was extraordinary is I know I have heard and seen Stormy Daniels describe her interlude with Donald Trump. But to actually walk into that courtroom was a moment where it made everything seem like, this is really the moment for this case. Because, her story is at the center of the hush money payments. She waltzed, as one of my colleagues said, sashayed into the courtroom. She was wearing black palazzo pants, a long black tunic, a black hoodie, and she had her hair, pinned up like when you go to the gym and you tie it in a loose ponytail with pieces falling out. Oh, and she had glasses propped on the top of her head.
Didn't go for the business suit thing.
Right, no business suit. And I was joking that she was kind of the antithesis of Hope Hicks, who is a former model and beautifully dressed in a business black pantsuit. But these are two women in Donald Trump's life, if you want to believe what the prosecutors allege. This is the woman he had an encounter with, a sexual encounter that the DA says is at the heart of their hush money case. She spoke so quickly. She was basically rattling off, spinning out her story, and it just was spilling out into the courtroom. It's very hard to keep up with her testimony. She was speaking so quickly.
From the transcripts, it seemed like she really seemed to be putting Trump down in both the encounter she had with him and in describing the encounter.
Well, she describes the encounter as something she didn't expect. She was invited by Trump. She meets Trump at a celebrity golf tournament in Lake Tahoe in Nevada. and Trump is there as one of the celebrities. He's on The Celebrity Apprentice. And she says she gets approached by Trump's bodyguard. She takes a photo with Trump, and he chats her up. Other women from her company that make pornographic adult films called Wicked Incorporated were there. And she was introduced as one of the people that not only was an actor in the adult films, but also a director and producer. So he said, "Oh, you're the smart one." And then later on, she was invited to Trump's room, for which he thought was dinner, and she described meeting Trump there. So she says that when she meets Trump, he says he reminds her of his daughter, blonde, beautiful, and taken for granted that people underestimate how smart they are. And they started talking about the industry, and Trump expressed a lot of business interest in the inner workings of the adult film industry and how movies are made and what kind of precautions are taken for sexually transmitted diseases and whether there's testing. So there was a lot of detail about that. And she said that whenever she talked to Trump, he was one-upping her. And she said when she met him, he greeted her at the hotel room dressed in silk pajamas. And she said, "Does Hugh Hefner know you've taken his pajamas?" Which was a joke reference to Hugh Hefner, who always likes to wear silk pajamas 24/7, the Playboy publisher.
She added some graphic and salacious details when talking about the alleged one-night stand. Did the prosecution bring that out, or did it just come out as she was talking?
It seemed the prosecutor, Susan Hoffinger, was trying to control her, and the judge had to take a couple of breaks and try to get Hoffinger to rein Stormy in because she was talking so fast and spilling out with all these details. So we heard about the black and white tile floor in Donald Trump's hotel room, and we heard about the bed being unmade in his bedroom, and lots of details that seemed extraneous. But at some points, it seemed that the prosecutor was trying to provide some details to show that she remains loyal to her recounting of this incident. There are elements that she's always maintained are the same, including the details of going into the bathroom at one point. She said they had a long discussion that when Trump showed her a copy of, I guess it was Forbes magazine that he was on the cover of, and she basically said to him something about, you're constantly interrupting me and one-upping me. And he said, "Oh, like, you think I need a spanking?" And she said he gave her the magazine and she rolled it up and patted him on the behind with it, which caused Mr. Trump to get angry yesterday. And some of my colleagues, I was sitting too far away, but they could have sworn they saw him mouth the word BS, the full word for BS. The judge heard something and basically remonstrated his lawyer, Todd Blanche, to speak to his client. And he later in the sidebar, we could see that the judge said that, it was contemptible what Trump was doing. You could hear him muttering, and he knows his client is not happy with her testimony, but he could have to control him because could be seen as intimidating the witness, and the jury was catching it.
When she talked about, the act itself, she didn't say it was involuntary, but she did say that, she didn't know how she ended up on the bed. Has she claimed that before?
She basically also said that she had blacked out, which is the first time she said this version of it, which prompted the defense to ask for a mistrial right after the lunch break. The judge pointed out that the defense had been sitting down and not objecting throughout her testimony. So he sort of chided them for not being more aggressive and standing up. And the judge pointed out, which was rightly so, many times the judge interrupted and said, "We're not going to hear any more of this." So when there was discussions of whether or not Trump used a condom during the interlude, judge said, "That's enough." He stopped it. So the judge is pointing out many times I objected without you asking me to. So, it's your job to object on behalf of the defendant, not my job. But he also said that he wanted the prosecutor to try to control Daniels more. I don't know whether it was nervousness or what, but she did spill out her story.
So the jury was paying attention, I take it?
Yes, and in fact, in the middle of her testimony during a break, at least 2 jurors asked the court officer for more notebooks, which I thought is something interesting to know.
There's a point at which this is sort of cringeworthy testimony. Did she come across as believable?
There's a debate. Some reporters say the jury has to believe that this happened, or else Trump won't get convicted. We have heard other testimony corroborating that this happened and what Trump did about it. So you could argue that the prosecution case rests on whether or not he paid the hush money payment because of this embarrassing episode. And we do see evidence. I mean, David Pecker talked about it happening, and none of these people had firsthand knowledge of it, but they put into evidence 2 photos, including one of Trump at the same golf tournament, and then another photo of him with Stormy wearing the exact same polo shirt and pants and baseball cap, smiling, hugging her. And she said that was taken the same day of this interlude. Whether or not the jury believes that the hush money payments were paid to keep this tawdry story quiet, I think is going to be the fundamental question for this jury. And I guess we now see, I mean, this is this young woman's version of growing up poor in Louisiana, working, loving horses, shoveling manure out of stables in her spare time to put herself through college, and then finally finding out that as an adult film actress and dancer, a stripper, she could make more money to put herself through school. And she said she wanted to go to veterinary school, and she was going to Texas A&M. So she had a story to be told about how this woman ended up being a stripper / porn star, ended up being with Donald Trump, what ends up being part of this hush money case.
A female defense attorney cross-examined her. Hasn't a male defense attorney been doing the cross-examinations up to this point?
Yeah, and you could argue that Susan Nichols, Donald Trump's one of the members of his team, is probably the most experienced lawyer of the group. She's got decades of experience as a criminal defense lawyer, and I've seen her in action in federal court. She's very smart, but they have kept her on the sidelines, and I wonder if they just kept her for being able to cross-examine a woman, because it looks less like a woman is beating up another woman as opposed to a man. Susan was tough with her, at some point basically suggesting that Daniels had concocted the story and basically embroidered her version of events. And initially, it didn't tell anybody that she'd had sex with Trump, and only added that later to help embellish her story and maybe get her some money. Stormy, sometimes she kind of hurt herself and sometimes she helped herself. A couple of times she gave back retorts to Nichols, like, you hate President Trump, don't you? And then Stormy said, yes, I hate him. You know, so this is the kind of thing where the jury could say she has animus against Trump, and this is why she's just doing it to make up the story.
Wait till Michael Cohen takes the stand. So now, one thing she said that seems hard to believe, she denied that this was for money, that she was asking for this hush money payment for monetary reasons.
Yeah, I mean, she said she was doing very well, but then basically she was reached out to by these people, and Donald Trump was now on the front burner because he was doing very well politically. This is in 2016. So earlier in 2016, there wasn't that much interest in it. She had said that originally her life was going really, really well, and then she decided that for money she could do, and she could sell the story, and it would be private. She had told her story, too, in some iterations to, like, In Touch magazine, which is a gossip magazine, and it was just about Donald Trump, the reality star. And that never went anywhere. It seems like in 2016, when Trump is running, she decides that she's going to sell her story, but to keep it quiet, which is why she takes the hush money payment, to keep the story from coming out. And then she says when Trump starts doing well, they were not paying her. If we remember, roll back the tape to testimony from Keith Davidson, her lawyer, Michael Cohen was playing them along and basically stringing them out of not paying the money and not wiring the money, and they would ask and they would ask and they would ask, and he wasn't paying it. And then basically Stormy was like, okay, I'll just go ahead. The deal's off and I'll tell my story. And then Michael Cohen, and the way the story goes, according to prosecutors, is that the Trump campaign is in such a dither over the Access Hollywood tape. They basically just want to put this fire out of Stormy, and let's get this off the front burner. So that's when Michael Cohen is willing to pay, but then the money, he doesn't get the money from Trump, and they start stringing Stormy and her lawyer along. So then she starts talking to other people, and then she gets paid off, and then she's quiet, and then she sees that Donald Trump is doing well. And that was an interesting quote she said yesterday, which was, "You saw the opportunity to make money, didn't you, to try to sell your story?" And she said, "I saw my opportunity to get the story out. I didn't put a price tag on it. That's why I did every interview for free." And then she said basically that the status changes because suddenly Trump is a presidential candidate. She said, "I had to do a check in my strategy. Originally, I was dealing with a reality TV star, but it's a whole different game when it's a candidate for office." The defense is still cross-examining her, and I think that Susan Nichols has at least several more hours on cross tomorrow when court resumes.
And we'll see how tough the cross-examination gets when it resumes tomorrow. Thanks so much, Pat. That's Bloomberg legal reporter Patricia Hurtado. And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Podcast. Remember, you can always get the latest legal news by subscribing and listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at Bloomberg.com/podcast/law. I'm June Grasso, and this is Bloomberg.